Okay, so now I want to finish up the history section with a few more comments about the 20th century and move into a little bit of commentary about the 21st century. So we have been spending a lot of time looking at various Protestant denominations and movements. So I wanted to go back and talk about the major movement within the Roman Catholic Church, and that is Vatican II. So in many ways, the Church, Roman Catholic Church, did not change much through the intervening centuries that we have been talking about. But in 1962, so it went from 62 to 65, Pope John Paul the 23rd called a council in Vatican, and it was called it's called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II. So we've all these ideas, from the very beginning of the church. This idea of when the church gets together to meet, it's called a council. So the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, was called by John Paul the 23rd, and it lasted from these years. And the goal was really, in many ways, to modernize the Catholic Church. It was quite revolutionary in the way that it did change the church. And if you go to a Catholic church today, most likely you're going to see the very big differences that this put in. What exactly did it do? So briefly, the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, called for the church to rewrite all of the liturgy so that people could say the Mass in the vernacular. This is a huge change. So vernacular, again, meaning the church, whatever language you speak. So up to this point, Latin. Latin had been the only acceptable language to conduct a church service. Mass is the Catholic term for a church service. So they said, no, you can use Latin if you want, but you don't have to. And then they began the process of rewriting the Mass in all the various languages. And so if you go into a church today and you hear a Roman Catholic church and you hear the Mass being given in anything other than Latin, then you are seeing the fallout or the change made by the Second Vatican Council. What else did they do? For lots, actually, but bringing the church into the modern era. They put in place ways for greater lay leadership within the Roman Catholic Church, which was very good, particularly because of the smaller and smaller numbers of men who are willing to commit to celibacy. So basically, before Vatican II, any ritual of the church had to be conducted by a priest and a priest only. Vatican II put into place training and various forms of lay ordination. So just to remind you, lay person or layman is the term we use in religion for anyone who is not a professional religious person. If you're ordained, you're not a lay person. If you are not ordained, you are a lay person, and therefore your leadership is outside of the professional elements of Christianity. So greater lay leadership. So you will see now in Catholic churches people who are not priests aiding the priests in the Mass and in giving communion. You will also see a priest would maybe bless the bread and the wine for communion, and then an appointed lay person would be able to take it to the hospitals to give that communion to people who are hospitalized or people who are bedridden, etc. So the allowance and the structure for allowing people who are not priests to aid in the rituals of the church. And then finally, a greater openness to non-Catholics, or ecumenism is what we call it. Ecumenism meaning sort of, that's a U. So ecumenical is anything that involves all of the different branches of Christianity. So ecumenism. So if you remember, the unum sanctum is that there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So remember that? Well, the Second Vatican Council said that, that's not necessarily fully true for Christians, other Christians. The idea, they call non-Catholic Christians separated brethren. So they still hold to some sense that salvation is owned in some unique way by the Roman Catholic Church, but allow that there is perhaps some salvation for those of us who are not Roman Catholic. So a lot happened in those 3 years, but these are the ones that are most important for our, sort of brief reading of these situations. So that's Vatican II. So then a couple more things before we finish up the history section. I wanted then to make some comments about a major movement of the 20th century, and that's Pentecostalism. So Pentecostalism, again, Pentecostalism. It's a 20th century movement, began in San Francisco, actually, in the early 1920s. It's most often associated with a place called Azusa Street. So, Pentecostalism is not a denomination. It is a movement. So, you will find that all Protestant denominations and even Catholic traditions will have some influence, potential influence from Pentecostalism. So, like I said, it's a movement. It is built off of this idea of having a personal encounter with the risen Lord, but it adds another element to it. It talks about the idea of second baptism. So our first baptism is in water. Whether you're sprinkled, whether you're immersed, we go in the water in some way. The second baptism, then, for the Pentecostal, is the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So Pentecostalism is a rereading of see the word Pentecost built into it. When in Acts 2, when the disciples are in Jerusalem awaiting the coming of the Holy Spirit comes to them while they are in Jerusalem celebrating the Pentecost. So that's where the name comes from, this story in Acts 2. And when the Holy Spirit descended on the individuals who are in that room at that time, they began to speak in tongues. And it enlivened them, and it's really in many ways the beginning of the church. So Pentecostal movements believe in the idea of spiritual gifts. They put a lot of emphasis on spiritual gifts, and specifically the sign of one's baptism in the Holy Spirit is the ability to speak in tongues. So if you go to a denomination that encourages the speaking in tongues, then you are part of the Pentecostal movement. If you are part of a larger denomination, but you are sort of a subgroup within it, then you are you've been influenced by this. So let me stop and say probably the most. Let me erase some of this. The most famous and the largest movement of denomination that arises out of Pentecostalism is the Assemblies of God. So the Assemblies of God Church is the largest Pentecostal denomination. And however, if you are a person who practices the speaking in tongues, but you don't go to a Pentecostal church, then you are known as a charismatic. So the Assemblies of God, and then if any church that has the word Pentecostal in it, they are all descendants of this Pentecostal movement that starts in the early 1900s in San Francisco. If you are a Methodist or a Roman Catholic, and you are part of a movement within those denominations that practices the spiritual gifts and speaking in tongues, and you're known as a charismatic. So that's the difference, whether you actually go to a Pentecostal denomination or you either just practice the values. So this idea of Pentecostalism has been extremely popular, and it has been very influential on American churches and then also in churches around the world. And we'll get to that when we talk about third world Christianity. But Pentecostal movements are extraordinarily powerful in the churches outside of this country. The missionary movement has taken it from our country around the world. So, and part of this has to do with the egalitarianism of it. This idea that all people are equally gifted and given gifts from God. The early Pentecostal movement was much more open to women's leaderships, to the mixing of blacks and whites in the church together. And it sort of circumvents education and those that are sort of understood as authoritative in the church, and allows the Spirit to choose, and is how they would say, not these what letters you have after your name or something like that. So it was very, very influential, and it has become very influential around the world. So the Pentecostal movement. The third world, like I said, as we move into the 21st century, we really then have to start thinking not about, in many ways, Europe for a long time was the center of development within Christianity. In Protestantism, that definitely moved to into the American sphere. So much of the development of Protestantism took place in the American context. The missionary movement of the 19th century brought those movements around the world, and really in the 21st century, well, we talk about in the 21st century as Europe as being post-Christian. Many of the great cathedrals are now nothing more than tourist sites with a small religious aspect left to them. So the 21st century. America, one could argue, is going in that direction. We're still a very religious nation, but the level of Christian faith and commitment is going down in this country. And so as we move into the 21st century, what we often refer to is the third world, is the heart and soul of the growth of Christianity in the heart and soul of the Christian movement. And there are a lot of ways to look at that and talk about that. I'm going to just talk about it in terms of numbers when we think about the third world Christianity. So if you were to sort of think about the biggest churches, another 20th century movement within Christianity are these mega churches, right? These huge churches. And there are lots of ways to count numbers when it comes to churches. But I'm going to give you figures for churches, the numbers in a single site. So a lot of churches will give you, how many people attend their church in a given Sunday. But they have satellite churches. So they'll have, one in this city, one in this city, one in this city, and they'll count the attendance for all of them. I'm looking at churches where we're looking at just one physical site. So when we talk about the numbers of people who are attending church, the largest one, and these figures change, and they are reported differently. So you might find something that says something a bit different, and the numbers go up and down depending on who's counting. But the largest church in the USA is Joel Osteen's church, Lakewood in Texas. So again, this is counting not all satellite, but just a single place. How many people move through that church? And it is between 43. It's got between 43 and 45,000 people who they say are members of that church and attend on a regular basis. Right? That's really huge. I find it hard to imagine. But if you start to look at the mega churches outside of the United States, Lakewood doesn't make the top 10 even. So if you look at, and again, this number shifts depending on who's counting, etc. The largest church in the world is in South Korea. They claim a weekly attendance of approximately 480,000 people. That's big. And if you look at the top 10 mega churches are in South Korea. So South Korea is a real hotbed of the growth of Christianity right now. 4 are in South America, and 2 are in what we call sub-Saharan Africa. So it is not us in this country. So the 21st century, third world, this is where the 21st century is going. We also talk a lot about in the 21st century of the African diaspora. The church is growing tremendously, both Roman Catholic and Protestant, in the African continent, the subcontinent of Africa. And those individuals, those churches are changing what Christianity looks like, and they are then going back to the rest of us. Soon America will be a missionary spot. So this idea of the growth, we could talk also about the Asian traditions, the Korean influences on the church overall. And so things are changing a lot. When we, a couple more statistics. So this is the world, right? But also when we turn our eyes back to the American context, again, we are soon I've no denominations that send missionaries to Europe, and I assume that there will be missionaries to the USA soon as we start to look less and less Christian to the rest of the world. There's a very, very famous study done about 5 years ago about the future of religion, basically, in the world. And so I'm going to give you the relevant statistic about Christianity. Right now, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Islam is second. This study, which is very well respected group and a very well respected study, said by the year 2050, there will be about as many Muslims in the world as Christians. We will no longer be the largest religion. Christianity will no longer be the largest religion. Islam will be more or less tied with us by 2050. Now, some of that is because of the growth of Islam through both birth and, so the natural increase with Islamic people having babies, but also through conversion. Christianity however, the real reason, so this is important, right? That people are converting to Islam. But when we talk about the future of Christianity, why is Islam gaining ground on them in terms of number? Not just because Islam is growing, but Christianity is shrinking. There are more and more people who might have called themselves Christian in years past, but who have left the church. So a lot of this decrease in the number of Christians around the world is not because Islam is growing that much more strongly, and it is growing, but it's just as much to do with Christianity. It is shrinking. So we look then to the third world, to places like South Korea and South America and Africa for the future of the church, where Christianity is still gaining ground in numbers. So this ends the history section of the class, and the rest of the class will be on theology, which we've been doing a lot of, but we'll come back and do some more of it.